Hello everyone, welcome to Divergent Minds, Neurodiverse Perspectives on Crime Writing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow my panellists to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Graham H. Miller.
Yeah, I'm Graham Miller. I'm autistic, this is why I'm here. I was late diagnosed. I've written two series. One is the Jonah Green series that are set in Cardiff about a coroner's officer who investigates suspicious deaths. And the other, which I've got the fourth book coming out in a minute, is the Angel and Haynes series set in a fictional kind of West Country county and a run-down seaside town.
Lovely, thank you. And then Seán Gibbons.
And I'm Seán Gibbons, and I suppose I was diagnosed as autistic when I was 19. But it's taken me a long time to actually come to terms with that. So I write the Ben Miller Investigate series, 4 books of which have been published by Superi Books. And they're set in Galway, which is on the west coast of Ireland. And they were based on my time spent as a taxi driver in the city. Each of the stories was triggered by something that actually happened to me. I'm also working on 2 other series of books for the same publishers.
Lovely, thank you very much. So just to start us off, I'm just going to define a few of the terms we're going to be talking about today, just in case people are less familiar with them. So when we talk about neurodiversity or neurodivergent people, what we're generally talking about is people with what are called neurodevelopmental disorders. Fancy word, essentially means that people's brains are shaped differently, and we think that happens very early on, either from birth or very early on in childhood. Traditionally used to refer to people on the autistic spectrum, people with autistic spectrum disorder, or people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, however, neurodiversity can also used to be applied with for people who have mental health conditions, so it's a broader term that's sometimes used, again, variably. And just to talk a little bit more about those 2 things. So autistic spectrum disorder is a lifelong condition. So as you've heard from Graham and John, people can be diagnosed late, or some people can be diagnosed very early. Tends to affect people's ability to interact socially, so not necessarily in the way that other people might expect them to, but also in terms of their order, routine, special interests, and those sorts of things. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that. And then just to talk a little bit about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. So the reason I'm chairing this panel is because I have ADHD. I was also very late diagnosed, about 4 years ago now. And as Seán said, there's a little bit of a journey then to recognise something that you've had all your life, but that you maybe didn't realise was affecting you in certain ways. It's a very interesting journey to go on. And that, people have a very stereotyped idea of young boys running around all over the place, causing chaos in the classroom, which tend to be the people who do get diagnosed when they're younger. But actually, we know a lot more about it now. So has difficulties with attention, as the attention part makes reference to, or hyperactivity and impulsivity. So what we're recognising a lot more about with lots of these conditions is actually they present very differently in women or people who are socialised female, who are raised that way, and what that means and accounts for some late diagnoses. So those are just the things we're going to be talking about today, just so that we've got clarity on what we're doing here and why we're specifically talking about this. So the first thing I wanted to have a think about as a panel is, as a neurodivergent writer, how do you feel your writing might differ from those people who are neurotypical, people who don't have ASD or ADHD? John, do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know how my writing might differ. Maybe if I talk about my reading, how I read, when I'm reading, I don't, for example, ever have any kind of image of what the characters might look like, or I wouldn't be able to kind of know what they're going to do next based on what's just happened. For many years I didn't read fiction at all. I used to only read non-fiction because I struggle with the idea of something that's not real and we're supposed to believe it's real when we're reading a book or watching a movie or something like that, which is something I don't do a great deal of. But when I'm writing, I'm not aware of it while I'm actually engaged in the physical act of writing the book. But afterwards, I can see patterns. For example, I probably never describe what the characters look like, and I don't have any idea myself what they look like. And I noticed that in my books, my characters, for example, never touch one another unless it's in an act of violence. My reading, I like things to be real. When I was growing up, it was a joke with my brother and me that everything for me had to be what I called really real. I couldn't just imagine or fantasize about things. It had to be real. So I probably still the same when it comes to my writing. As I said to you, my books are based on things that actually happened to me, not necessarily me as the victim of something, but I would have been involved. And I wouldn't always have understood what was happening at the time, but they certainly provided me with fodder for my writing. And so I suppose, and I write in a linear fashion. I often hear people talking about how they write books and they write a bit here and a bit there and they put them all together. I just start at point A and go to point Z, and A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I can't do it any other way. I've tried to be more, what you might call maybe artistic maybe in my writing style or something like that, but I realise I can't do it. It has to be that linear pattern for me.
Yeah, and I think you can really tell that when you're writing, Seán. Like, it's very grounded. It is very real. You get a very strong sense of the city and what is and what isn't happening. And I think that is really useful, because I think that is something that you can bring, is that really sense of grounded realness. You don't get the sort of artistic, very vague description of things that sometimes you can get, a very poetical description. Actually, things are very, very real. I think you portray very real. So I think that's a really core strength of your writing. Graham, what do you think? Do you think it affects your works and how you write?
Yeah, I think it does. I think I see it as a strength because I was late diagnosed in my mid to late 40s. And as you mentioned, it's a social thing. And looking back, and you've probably got this as well with a late diagnosis, you go back and you reevaluate everything. And I was often quite popular in university, but I was always had the feeling I was on the outside of groups looking in. But then, of course, as a writer, that's exactly where you should be. You know, a writer is somebody who observes everything that's happening and everything that's going on around them. And, you know, it gradually dawned on me that I kind of observe and I see an awful lot more than neurotypical people do. So it's given me that kind of detached observational style to be able to write. And quite often I just things seem obvious to me and I just write them, and then people are like, how did you think of that? Or how did you link those two things together? And for me, it's just like, well, they just, it seems really obvious to me, but obviously it gives you a different voice, a different way of looking at the world and talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that, again, I think that comes through in your books, and that very strong line through of like observation and the ways societies or different parts of things works. I think the one that I've just read of yours about the first in your Angel series. It's very good about that kind of outsider's perspective on a very strong culture, and I think that's a real strength when you're writing an outsider character, to be able to portray that really, really vividly.
And the other thing I've done, one of the it's kind of almost meta, but as an autie, I've kind of got interested in autism and neurodiversity as almost like a special interest, and that kind of, especially in the later books, that comes through quite a lot.
Yeah. No, that's really good. I think so. It's interesting because obviously, in lots of ways, ADHD is very different to ASD. And I think I say this to, because my other job is that I'm a psychiatrist. And I say this to a lot of couples who I have, where one person has ADHD and one person has ASD, and which happens quite frequently, actually, about strengths in your relationship and actually leaning into those strengths. I think sometimes when we talk about disorders or neurodivergent people, we're often talking about weaknesses, particularly when you're diagnosing someone.
I mean, you say that, but something like 40% of people diagnosed with ADHD, no, 40% of autistic people are also ADHD.
Yes, so a lot of crossover.
And I've kind of noticed it. I mean, Seán said he writes beginning to end, and a lot of people do. I'm normal like a kind of shotgun that just fires scenes at the page, like here, there, everywhere. I say, when I've got about 30% of the way through my word count, I've written the ending. So I think with crime books, I love the ending, the big kind of, let's resolve it and tie it all up. So I'm usually there, 90,000 word book, I'd have written 30,000 words and the ending will be down. And then I'll just kind of go back, and my wife says I've got quite a lot of ADHD traits mixed in with my autism. I can get hyper-focused really easily, but I'm not super organised and have everything kind of in the right place. It's kind of a lot more chaotic.
And it's really interesting for the people who have both, because you tend to get bits that kind of dominate in different situations. So one of the things, when you're just out of interest, when you're diagnosing ADHD, you talk about organisation and kind of like ask like, oh, how's your space at home? And for the people who have both, they're like super organised. Everything's where it is. Like routine and order is really important to me. I need to be super structured. And that tends to be the one where it's like what would be a classic ADHD symptom that just doesn't happen when people have both. That's what I say. It's a skill.
As you see, my house is really untidy, quite chaotic, and the bookshelves are, that bookshelf is non-fiction, that is fiction, alphabetical by author.
Yes.
But aside from the bookcases, there's mess everywhere.
All right.
So it's kind of...
Need a beautiful bookcase. As I
just it's a mashup of both.
But it's interesting because when I'm writing with ADHD, so I plan to a certain extent. So I like to know how it ends. But apart from that, I can't plan anymore because I get bored. So I'm not interested anymore. So if I planned it and if I knew what was happening scene by scene, I wouldn't then write it. I've done that to myself before, is I planned out a book, but then in my head it was done. Like I didn't want to write it. I didn't want to get engaged in it again because my brain fires on interest. I have to be interested in things to be motivated to do them. Editing is hard in that respect, especially when it's like the second or third. And like, thankfully, nobody who publishes me is here because like when I'm doing that like second, like final proof copies, I'm like, I am so bored of this book. I do not want to read it again.
And your brain tends to skip. You're just
it does. I'm like, and I'm done.
You're like, I know what happens here. I'll just gloss.
I've hardly ever reread any of my books once I've finished. I'm like, that's done. I'm not interested anymore. It's gone. It's gone out of my head completely. And I think that's really interesting about what you need to be able to write. But it's one of the things that's weakest in... So people with ADHD tend to be broad brushstrokes people. So I can get an impression of something very quickly and then make a decision about it. Whereas generally speaking, again, we're not a monolith. People are very different within the spectrums of both disorders. More detail focused, so much more cutting in.
Sorry, I suppose I'd be very organised in some senses, but like you, I get bored very quickly with things.
Yeah.
And I can get bored halfway through writing a book and say, with the characters, with everything, and it can be a real effort to keep going to the end, whatever that's going to be. And I think as time has gone by, I've begun to notice in myself some characteristics of ADD as well, probably the thing of getting bored very quickly and risk taking. All over my life I was never risk averse, which is probably why I ended up in some of the situations I did as a taxi driver, because some of them, if anyone has read the books, were borderline criminal. I was kind of lucky, I think, on a few occasions that I wasn't in the dock with some of my fares, but it didn't seem to bother me at the time, and it doesn't bother me now, and like you, I tend to forget very quickly about things. I read a story or watch a film or television, and as soon as it's over, it's gone. I have no memory of it whatsoever,
Yeah, it's a really strong out of sight, out of mind thing. So that's one of those things, the thing that everyone gets of like they meant to do something and they left the room and it's not there anymore. And then you're like, I have to go back and retrace your steps, remember what it is. Like that happens to me with everything. That happens to me with people. So I forget my friends exist if I don't see them. And they have to be like, the kind of maintenance of friendship is really hard for me. Like if I'm not seeing somebody regularly or keeping in contact with them, I just forget. And then when I see them again, it's like we've not been apart. So that is immediately back for me again. And it's the same with my book series, actually. If I pick them up again, I'm like, oh, yeah, I remember you guys. Like, we've been here before. But there's a really interesting kind of research coming in about the ideas. So, I mean, these are relatively new diagnoses. Like, these are relatively new understandings of things, and I think our understanding of them is evolving all the time. But there's a lot of new theories coming out that it's probably all just one big thing, and people have different aspects or different bits of it that present in different ways. So there's a lot of crossover. So like dyspraxia is one of those things. So being incredibly clumsy or struggling to learn mechanical tasks, so things like learning to drive a car. I found that really difficult. Like procedural tasks, learning those kind of things, it really sticks for me. But it's a thing that goes very strongly with ADHD, but it's not a thing that's known for being ADHD. So I think we're getting to a point where we're evolving our understanding. It's a spectrum. They're spectrums. We don't know a lot about it yet.
Have you heard of aphantasia?
Yes.
Because that's what Seán described, where people don't have a mental image in their head. It's like described as if you say to somebody, imagine an apple. Some people will actually see like an apple, three-dimensional light and everything. And people, I'm guessing, like Seán, will just have nothing. And I actually know there's a really famous writer who says he can churn out like literally 5 or 10 books a year because he sees everything in words. He's got aphantasia. He doesn't see the images, so he doesn't have to see a beach and then think, oh yeah, there's a beach and there's a sun and describe it. He actually just thinks in words, so he can just go from brain to page and he churns out the books.
There's all those ideas about people's internal worlds, and I guess it's one of the reasons, why I was quite late diagnosed with ADHD, is that until I started diagnosing other people with ADHD, I was just like, this is just how it is. Like, I had literally no idea, and then I was like, oh, hang on a minute, is that not normal? Does not everybody do that? Oh, okay, apparently they don't all do that. That probably is me. And actually, I'm still learning new things about myself and about other people with ADHD, and when I meet quite a lot of people with ADHD, obviously, in the course of my work, and I was just like, oh yeah, okay, that's a thing that I hadn't twigged was part of ADHD until you just described it. And it's nice because I can also be that person for other people. This is always helpful. One of the things I thought would be good to talk about is that there is a little bit of a trope that's been around, it's slightly fading out now, much to my relief, of the autistic detective. We had a bit of a surge of it a couple of years ago. It seemed every detective was autistic. Sometimes it's not done well necessarily, and other times you can be like, oh, okay, yeah, I kind of get that. Were there any of those portrayals that that resonated you? Any that you kind of thought, okay, yeah, no, they've got that bit right? Graham, anything leap to mind for you?
I think the one thing that's really interesting is that Sherlock Holmes was originally written before autism was discovered or written down. I don't know what the correct phrase is. Nobody knew that there was a thing called autism. And you kind of look back at the kind of canonical character of Sherlock Holmes, and he's really socially awkward. He's blunt to the point of being rude a lot of the time. He's got fantastic memory. He obviously has quite serious problems. He keeps disappearing off to opium dens. And I think it's kind of gone through from there that, that's kind of set the blueprint almost, that they've got to be somebody apart to be a detective. And I haven't seen many that have been done well, to be honest, and I think a lot of people do what I call the kind of Big Bang Theory get-out clause, where with the Big Bang Theory there's this character, Sheldon, who is kind of annoying and is infantilized by his roommates and is the butt of a lot of jokes. And the writers said, we didn't write him as an autistic character, and there's one famous line where he says, well, I'm not mad because my mum had me tested. But then the actor, Jim Parsons, who plays Sheldon Cooper, I said, oh yeah, I play him as Asperger's. So then they've they've got their cake and they're eating it at the same time. They can kind of play jokes and poke fun at autistic people, but at the same time they can back off and go, oh no, we're not making fun of autistic people because we didn't write it as. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of cherry picking where they kind of take the best bits, as it were. And I'm not just saying this because we're on the panel. I think your Amy Lane is probably one of the best because she does not have an easy time of it. It's not like she's neurodiverse. I can't remember if you've actually canonically coded her as autistic or ADHD, but she's neurodiverse, she's got mental health problems, and it's not like, oh look, this gives her a set of skills to solve crimes, woohoo. She's agoraphobic, she gets sectioned about once every 2 books, give or take. On average. She has proper major breakdowns. Her life is hell. and she's also got the skills to solve crimes. So, and I'm not just saying that because we're sitting next to each other on a panel, that, it's actually a much more rounded, the highs and the lows.
Yeah. So what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with Graham about Sherlock Holmes, especially the television version there some time back with Benedict Cumberbatch. I mean, that was borderline parody at times, and I don't think it did much of a service to people on the spectrum. And I'm afraid I haven't read your book yet. I will get around to it though. But it's like a lot of the tropes in crime fiction, of the hard-bitten detective. It was a drink problem or a drug problem or relationship problems. They get tedious after a while, and autism, I think it's, unless you've experienced it, it's something very difficult to write about, because it's not, as you said, the kind of the Jim Parsons or Sheldon experience. It can be very difficult at times, and as a child, when you look back over your childhood and you realise the things that you had to deal with, and not understanding why it was so difficult and different for you, it's not something to be used, I suppose, for entertainment or whatever. There are real people who suffer seriously as a result of being on the spectrum. But that said, obviously, given the amount of detectives in the world's population, there's going to be a certain percentage of them who are autistic. Whether or not they're going to be well written is another thing entirely,
Yeah, and I think you've really hit it there in terms of BBC Sherlock. I remember when they declared, they were like, "Oh, it's his Asperger's playing up again." I was like, "Oh no!" I get it. It immediately like heart-sink moment for me, because they had played around with it in such a bad way. I really liked the bridge, because I felt that they didn't ever specifically say about Sarah, but I actually thought that was a really nice portrayal of someone who was neurodiverse, who it caused her a lot of problems, actually, more problems than it was useful. So that the things that were helpful for her in crime solving were more than outweighed by how she struggled with her interactions with her colleagues in her personal relationships and things like that. And I thought that was quite good.
I think there's a lot of fear out there among, especially neurotypical script writers, because what's happened is, as the internet has come of age, and there's a fabulous book called Neurotribes by Steve Silverberg, which is a history of autism. And what happened is, as the internet came of age, autistic children grew up. And then now there is actually an autistic culture out there, and there are autistic groups. And like, for example, not to criticize, but Asperger's is not being used anymore. And,
absolutely.
it was basically, Hans Asperger was in the Nazi party, he was German, and his job was to decide which of these weird, broken children would be useful to the Third Reich and which ones wouldn't. And unfortunately, you can guess what would happen to the ones who weren't. So, but I think writers are very scared of canonically saying, this guy is autistic, he's got an autistic diagnosis, because then the community will go over it with a fine-tooth comb and go, well, why did he say that? Why did he do this? And, I mean, at first, I didn't feel confident enough to kind of own my autistic identity, if that makes sense. And I was late diagnosed, but I do actually want to write a genuinely autistic detective, and I'll just take the hits when they come. Because, one autistic person, they're all different. It won't be everybody's experience. I think the one thing they always miss is meltdowns.
Yes.
I can't think of any fictional autistic character, whether coded as such or not, who actually has proper meltdowns. And they are actually a part of the identity.
No,
they are.
Or a portrayal, I think, of stimming that's positive. I've never seen that done well either.
Stimming is self-stimulating behaviour. The typical thing is like flapping and stuff. Actually, bizarrely, when I was diagnosed, I thought, I'd never do that. And then I realised a really kind of low-key thing. If I'm either in a supermarket or in the kitchen, if I'm looking for something, I'll start going like that. And it actually makes my brain work better.
Yeah.
And it's so subtle that, I could just be in a supermarket looking at the shelves going, where's the oh, there. And unless I actually, obviously now you all know, but it's kind of, it's not you think of stimming and you often think of, kids running around flapping their hands or making weird noises or being disruptive, but it can be quite, even things like, I was at a Authie parents group and they were asking when their kids would stop sucking their thumb or anything. And when I'm thinking, I sit there like that. And I was like, well, give it 50 or so years and then we'll see when they stop, because I can actually make my little finger go numb. Like if I'm writing and I'm trying to think of a plot, I'll be like, and then I won't realise that I'm actually biting it quite hard.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of those things that actually I resisted for a long time, things like the fidget toys and things like this. But I spend a lot of time in meetings now, which are varying degrees of dull. And I find meetings very difficult. And I have a collection of fidget toys on my desk now or in my bag, so that if I'm going to something where I know I have to sit still and listen for a long time, that I've got something.
Yeah, I've got key rings in my pocket that I can fit.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I didn't realise was stimming. I don't know who else does this, but like, I'll look out of a window and there'll be like a bar down the middle of the window, and I'll move my head until that bar lines up with a street lamp outside. Or I'll line up like the cracks in the table, and apparently that's stimming as well. It's just, something I've always done. So now looking at like, things I can see from the stage.
I'd say, ADHD portrayals in fiction are pretty much absent, to be honest. I hardly ever seen any, again, apart from a quick joke. So the kind of quick joke of like, we've given you too much coffee, they're running around like that. It's disruptive. It's almost always a comedy disruptive child rather than anything positive.
Actually, it's the other way around.
Brilliant.
Coffee tends to calm them down.
It's a real split, interestingly, for caffeine. Can go either way. Same for cocaine, folks, in case you're interested. But it's amphetamine that very reliably toggles that switch for people with ADHD.
Yeah,
but caffeine and cocaine can go either way.
There's a meme on Facebook in one of the Authie ADHD spaces that said this guy went to a music festival and one of his friends had scored some Ritalin off his brother. He just basically stole it off his brother, and they were all like, yeah, let's speed. And they all took Ritalin, and then he just sat there reading a book, and it was the first time in his life he could concentrate. And all his other friends were like, party! Yeah. And he was like, I can concentrate on this book, this is fabulous. Yeah. And then he was like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely diagnostic. I sometimes will ask people, be like, so ever done amphetamine? How did it go? Because it almost always they're like, yeah, it was awful. My friends were all having the time of their lives and I was sat quietly in the corner. I went to sleep.
Yeah.
The classic cup of coffee before bed. But I think it's really interesting about those portrayals.
I think it has a lot to do with the fact that not alone do people who aren't on the spectrum not understand the ASD or whatever. It's people who have ASD or AD, they don't fully understand it either, It's not as if you can kind of sit down and write out a list and say, this is what I am, These are the things that mark me as being on the spectrum, because they keep emerging. As I said, I was 19 and I didn't really take in the diagnosis at the time, and so I had many years in which I was, I suppose, not even denying it, because I wasn't conscious of it. I'd kind of forgotten about it, to be honest with you, but many years in which I was probably what you might call masking it and trying to fit in, and actually doing a worse job when I was trying to fit in than if I had just let it be. I have so many memories of being told, to make eye contact, to smile. I usually thought I was doing all of that. But people were saying I wasn't, but then I used to kind of think, why don't you just leave me alone? I don't bother you, so why are you always trying to shape me to be the way you want me to be, and I think it's part and parcel of it. As for stimming, I think my wife knows what that's like, I have all kinds of finger clicking movements and things, if I have the remote and I'm flicking a piece, and I know it's all that I'm always looking for patterns, and I change the patterns when I'm doing it. But I find it relaxing and stimulating at the same time. I need to, if I'm trying to think about something, I need to be doing something like that to actually get my brain to function, and it prevents me getting bored, because when I do get bored, I just forget that there's anything. I have no problem yawning and stretching and.
I think that's really interesting. I think it really fits well with kind of that kind of social model of disability. Is that we live in a world that's set up for a certain type of brain, like a neurotypical brain, and actually a lot of the things we butt up against is trying to fit into that space or fit into somebody else's idea of what is socially acceptable behaviour, how a conversation goes. I often find it very freeing when I'm in a space with other people who have ADHD or who at least know me well enough that I can just run
just
on
be.
and just
I
be.
mean, the classic one is that, as a kind of overview, autistic people and probably ADHD as well, if you tell them something like, oh, I was really scared, had to take my cat to the vet, for example, they'll say, oh my God, I remember when my dog cut his paw, it was terrible. And apparently neurotypical people see this as just making it all about you. And the neurotypical response is to go, oh, that must have been terrible, how did you feel? And there's this, like you say, there's a different, and I think both of them are valid. Both of them are empathizing and showing that you care. It's just a different way.
Yeah, and yes, it is common for both ASD and ADHD, that kind of relevant anecdote thing of like, I'm relating to you by explaining when I felt similarly in that situation, rather than thinking about your thing. And it's one of those things, kind of those social codes or the social language, which I guess can be quite tricky to decipher. And again, not necessarily realizing that you're doing it. So, I have a job in which I do have to do a lot of social coding, and that I do that pretty regularly, and I can do it when I'm sort of in a masked professional space. And then when I have to do it for myself, I find it really hard. And I find that really tiring. So what people who've been in the festival weekend will know that there was a lovely big party last night, so lovely, and I'm like, I'm going back to my hotel room and have a reset and just sit quietly with myself and just feel that, let that all settle down, because I love socializing. I find it really good, but I need to take a recharge time. I need to reset. And again, these are things you learn about yourself, I think, as you live with a condition over time. And I'm still learning every day. I'm learning new things about how my neurodiversity comes out. So say a fellow writer said, oh, I really want to write a character on the autistic spectrum or a neurodiverse character. What advice would you give for them? Seán, do you have any? What would you say to them?
First question would be why? Why are you doing that? What's the reason for choosing to write that particular character, and what do you know about what you're going to write about? And if they don't know much or they can't explain why, I would suggest that they either don't do it or else go and find out as much as they can about the condition before they try to, because otherwise it won't be a realistic character. And I don't get offended or outraged or anything like that about things like that, but if you want to write good, realistic fiction, you really need to know what you're writing about.
Yeah, absolutely. Graham, what do you think?
Yeah, I think as a main character, it is fraught with danger. I see it the same as what you call protected characteristics. Like, if I wanted to write a main character detective who's going to underpin a series, who would say a person of colour or LGBTQ+, I wouldn't do it because it's not my place to represent those people. And in a way, I'd be kind of taking away the chance for them. I'll be taking up a space that they could be occupying. And it's the same for autistic people. Have a lot of barriers to getting published, to getting books. And neurodiverse people have a lot of barriers. And if somebody neurotypical is coming along and taking up some of that space, and as you say, society is set up for the neurotypicals, they will find it easier to get published, they'll find it easier to get an agent, and there's a danger that they could kind of drown out the authentic voice with their kind of, well, I'm looking from the outside and this is what I think it is. But I think it's important to have them as kind of side characters in a way, because otherwise, if I follow my advice, my books would all be about old white men, and that would be or middle-aged, grumpy white men, and that would be just almost as bad. That'd be like whitewashing. The world isn't just... So, yeah, I think it's a real kind of balancing act to kind of get some of the diversity in there. Interestingly, George R.R. Martin described his writing process where he would think of a character, and he would think, well, this character, I need this one to do this job in the plot. They're going to be, the second son of one of the great houses. They're going to be devious. They want to be plotting. I said son. Anyway, second child of one of the houses. They're going to want to be plotting to overthrow. They can be willing to kill to get to be head of a great house. And then he says when he's done all that, he decides if they're male or female. So he actually just has his idea of a character and how it's going to serve the plot. And to get very technical about writing, I think a character should transform throughout a book. They should have challenges, and when they overcome those challenges, it should be transformative. And that's basically what a plot is. But he kind of thinks of all that in terms of a character. And then afterwards he kind of thinks, shall I make someone male or female? And I think that's really how writers should operate, especially nowadays. You know, you should have a character and you go, this character's doing this job in my book. Oh, actually, that would actually work if they're ADHD. Or, actually, there's no reason why that couldn't be a black woman or a Hispanic man or, you know, but not kind of, as Seán said, not kind of go at it and go, oh, we need an autistic character here for diversity. Kind of like the Dumbledore problem where J.K. Rowling just went, oh, there's nobody gay in my books. Oh, Dumbledore, yeah, tick, move on.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I think I often find that with kind of TV casting. I think, you know, you kind of write, when people are writing that and then they cast people, it's like kind of then, okay, well, now I've got this character over this series, then now if I made them, say, a black woman in this role, then the way that person moves through the world is going to be impacted by the fact that she's a black woman now. So when I'm writing the next episode and the next episode, I'm going to have to adapt it. I'm going to have to use that person's portrayal and think about how that affects it. I agree. I think sometimes... I think people underestimate how much those different things can sometimes affect kind of what kind of things. I mean, like, we're all up here on like a stage in front of like a massive auditorium is not the most comfortable place really for any of us to be. And that's really interesting about that kind of idea about, okay, you know, a panel, like a being on a panel in front of things, like a thing that maybe people are like, oh yeah, no, that's fine. That's a thing that people can just do. And actually being like, okay, no, that's tricky. And it's something, you know, like I have a number of, I guess, marginalizations. I have a number of characteristics that affect how I move through this world. And my husband, who is a straight white man, sometimes struggles with that. He's like, oh, can we go to the pub after the football? I'm like, absolutely not. We can't go to the pub after football. Like, you will feel happy in that space. You will enjoy it. You will feel comfortable. I am like there's a number of things, like being a woman in that space, being a brown woman in that space, being someone with ADHD in a noisy environment where a lot of people are drunk and behaving unpredictably. Absolutely not. I want nothing to do with that. And that's really hard sometimes to explain. Obviously, we've been married for quite a while now, so it's a little bit easier for him. But it's hard to explain that. And I think then if you're trying to put that on the page, I think that can be really difficult to translate for other people.
I think... You know, the issue is broader than that, really, in terms of portrayal of general diversity. There's no point in just having diversity in a book just for the sake of it, because the fact really is that most of us live in contexts that aren't very diverse. You know, my life context isn't brimful with diversity of any type. You know, and I would imagine that's the way for most people, you know, and so sometimes watching a TV program or reading a book where every base seems to be covered, you kind of think, why, you know, what's this about, you know? I mean, can they not just have normal people, you know, whatever that is, you know, and
I guess that's really interesting about context, because it is the kind of context people move in. Like when you kind of describe your police department about, you know, being very uniform in lots of ways, and actually the fact that someone's a woman being such a big deal to them, because even that level of diversity is such a culture shock in that particular community. But it's very interesting of kind of the people who I see at work are relatively uniform in terms of their characteristics. My friendship group at home, people often say this about kind of, you know, like queer people group together. So like I have a lot of trans friends, I have a lot of people of colour in my friendship group, which wouldn't necessarily look like someone else's friendship group, but actually those people kind of go together. Or how many neurodiverse people that you have in a friendship group, either because you've actively chosen to be in a community that's celebrative or accessible, or because you've gravitated towards each other and you didn't really know why until actually one by one you all get diagnosed with things. But I think that's a really interesting idea about when we set our books about being realistic. You know, most police departments aren't diverse.
I mean, I had years, probably 20, 30 years ago now, I had jury duty and I lived down in Kent in a really rural part. I think the jury duty itself was in Canterbury, so it was East Kent. And I remember thinking, I was in this room, there were 50 people literally stick a pin in the electoral roll randomly chosen by computer. And I'm not joking, 48 of them were white, and there were 2 Chinese people.
Yeah.
And I just thought, that's not me being racist. It's the fact that they've just randomly picked 50 people off the electoral roll. And then you kind of walk around places like that, and you go to school, and my wife's Jewish, which makes my kids Jewish. And they were literally the diversity tick, because they were pretty much the only non-Christians in the primary school.
It is. It's a really interesting idea about community. We've got just under 15 minutes left, so I'm happy if anyone's got any questions for us or anything that they would like to ask. I don't know if there's a mic for Phil. We'll have a mic for you if you've got anything you'd like to ask. If not, we probably will just talk. I will certainly, because I don't know when to stop talking. Oh, yes, at the back there. Oh, wait for the mic. We can't guarantee we're going to hear you.
That's so interesting. Thanks, all of you. I was wondering if neurodiverse writers tend to lean towards crime fiction as a genre, or are there neurodiverse writers in every genre?
Oh,
Does
that's
it
an interesting
attract
question.
particularly?
I think you before, Hannah, you were saying, Seán, you don't tend to read crime as much.
Yeah,
Your
I
reading
don't tend
taste.
to read. I think the reason I started writing crime fiction really is because it fitted in what had happened to me, particularly as a taxi driver, and other experiences in my life, you know. I couldn't really have written a kind of romance about it or anything like that, or, you know, it was just what it was.
Yeah. What do you think, Graham?
I think you're probably right. I think they are, and I think it's maybe not a good thing. I remember I used to just write everything I wrote, like cross-genre, time travel, science fiction. And I actually had a point probably 10, 15 years ago now where I thought, I want to get successful at this. And one of the first things to do is to just go, here's a genre, stick to it. So when people see Graham H. Miller, they think crime book. And at the time, before I was diagnosed, I thought, well, I've got a crossword type of a brain. I love solving puzzles. So therefore, crime fiction, you know, where you can set up a puzzle and solve it, would fit for me. I think it's a bad thing because I think, as we've been saying the whole afternoon, you tend to pigeonhole neurodiverse characters. And one of the things you pigeonhole is that they don't fall in love. They don't have relationships. I've been married over 30 years. I've got 3 kids. And I think there should actually be, you know, neurodiverse romance books.
No,
Definitely.
absolutely.
I mean, I would imagine there's a lot of neurodiverse writers in science fiction fantasy.
Yes, it's quite a
I
lot.
would just, you know, off the top of my head, but I really think there should be. I think I might start poking around that in the Auti groups.
Well, I think it's really interesting because you see it kind of indie. My first publisher was a romance publisher, so I still have quite a lot of contact with a lot of romance authors. And you get it quite in like the indie publishing for romance. I think it's interesting about both crime and mystery particularly, and romance, is they're very structured. So you've got strong expectations, you know how it's going to end, like, you know, you're going to get a resolution, there's a predictability to it, of a different structure. And I think that's quite appealing. I would say, I certainly find that appealing about those books.
You see, I read, I'm going to say chick lit or contemporary women's fiction, whichever you prefer, because it is actually the same. You know, instead of knowing you start with a body and you end up with a killer being caught, you know, you start with 2 people who probably hate each other and there's no way they can be together, and you know they're going to get together, and the joy is in the journey. And, you know, the structures are actually, in my head, the patterns are quite similar.
It's really interesting because romance as a genre is really strong on tropes. Like
Yeah.
they actively market and label their books by trope. And I think to a certain extent we do that in crime. Like, you know, kind of we go like, oh yeah, no, this is, you know, the subgenres are very strongly trope based. All things like the hard drinking detective is like almost a code. But actually that kind of coding and that very structured approach to it, I think is really
And
helpful.
romance goes down to like really kind of specific.
Very, very specific things, because, you know, you're looking at something that's very taste-driven, but also, again, knowing exactly where you are with a book, knowing before you go in exactly what to expect and how to enjoy it. And having that framework or structure can sometimes make some of those things really easier to understand. I find, in terms of genre, is that I've drifted not away from crime, because I still write, I love a good mystery, but I write more science fiction fantasy now. And I write more protagonists now who are similar to me. And I think that is very different. And I think we're seeing a little bit more of a trend now of when I was talking about this earlier, when I first wrote Amy Lane Mysteries, that first book was published in 2014, but I first wrote that book in 2011. I'm a very different person now. I mean, I wasn't diagnosed. It's interesting you mentioned about Amy, because I wasn't diagnosed when I wrote that book, when I wrote any of those books, actually. And it's interesting then, what may I have accidentally or incidentally put into those things, not knowing that that was a thing.
There is that classic, which I think all three of us have said, where it's like, well, doesn't everybody do that?
Yes.
You know.
Yes.
Why is that diagnosable? Everybody does that, and then you kind of realise very slowly that they don't.
If it's any help at all, I've always had rather a criminal mind. I would probably have had a very good career as a criminal. I have written some stories, short stories that haven't been published about my juvenile criminal career, you know. My wife is familiar with one of them. It's when I was a child, I was fascinated with Robin Hood, but it wasn't enough for me to play being Robin Hood. I had to be Robin Hood, and it wasn't enough to pretend to rob the rich to give to the poor. I actually had to rob the rich to give to the poor, much to the chagrin of both the rich and my mother in particular, you know. So I have been toying with the idea of maybe putting some more of those stories on paper and, well, on the computer screen first, I suppose, and making something of them. But yeah, I've often been kind of taken aback by the criminal lean that I've noted in myself.
Any other questions? Oh.
Hi, thank you also for a very, very interesting talk. I am quite prepared to accept this is a really stupid question. I hope it's not offensive to anyone, but I'm just wondering, listening to you all, you talk about neurotypical people. Is anyone actually neurotypical, or just more what's seen as neurotypical? I think, are we not all on one big spectrum with different variations?
So it's a really interesting idea. I guess I'm going to put my psychiatrist hat on a minute here. In that mental illness or what's socially acceptable and what isn't has always been defined that way. So there's a point where being low in mood tips over into depression. And it's defined at a certain functional point. Now, for most of mental disorders, there's no diagnosis, there's no test. It's all a category. So at some point, we decide somewhat arbitrarily where that line is. So when people say, I'm a bit OCD, and they mean that they maybe are really into cleaning, for example, or ordering. But actually, to a certain extent, people with what kind of obsessive compulsive traits don't quite hit the threshold for disorder, but those things could potentially become a problem for them, or in a certain context might be a difficulty, but they don't hit that threshold. And to a certain extent, like we were talking about kind of that cross-diagnosis stuff, is that people who...
Actually,
yeah, sorry,
I actually think, if you don't mind me saying, I think that's quite a common attitude. And I actually think it's quite a dangerous one, because it kind of, as an autistic person, I need accommodations. I need downtime to recharge my batteries. Like Rosie said, I need the world to be different for me. And if you start saying, oh, we're all a little bit autistic, you're denying me the chance to get what I need to function. You're saying, well, you're not actually different. And as Rosie said, there is a line. I mean, the famous thing in, again, the Auti community and the Auti culture is, it's like being pregnant. You might have swollen ankles, you might have a bad back, but you can't be a little bit pregnant. You are or you're not. And it's the same with being autistic. You know, you might have some of the traits that might be there in a low level, but you either are or you aren't. And there's like evidence now, is it something like 57% genetic component to it, something like that? So it is actually a difference in our brains that is coded in our genes, that's there from when we're born, it will be there when we die. And you know, we are different, and it's important that we recognise that we're different, and it's important that the neurotypical world recognises that we're different, because, and I'm not having a go at you, this is something that comes up quite often, and you don't often get a chance to kind of argue back against it, so it's kind of a bit of a rant.
No.
That, you need that line.
Get it out, Graham.
I worked in social care for many years, and I worked with a lot of people who had intellectual disabilities, but wouldn't have been on the spectrum. And I worked with many people who were on the spectrum and had intellectual disabilities. And it is possible to tell the difference between people who are what you might call neurotypical and those who aren't. I mean, when I worked in one particular place, my colleagues were wondering who was organising certain things in a certain way. They thought one of the service users had developed a new trait, but it was actually me. When I went into that house in the morning, I had to go and fix certain, I suppose I used to call them markers, to be in a particular way for me to be able to actually relax and perform my job. And if I couldn't do that for whatever reason, I would get extremely anxious. And even if one of the service users was having a meltdown himself that day, I'd still have to get in behind him and turn the coffee jar to face out or whatever it was. And in so doing, I could have found myself getting a nice clip around the ear or something, but that was less concerning than what would have happened to my mental state for the day had I not been able to do what I needed to do.
And I think that's where it comes into it. I think, we talk about the social model of disability, when we talk about adjustments. So often, I mean, particularly for ASD, for ADHD, there is, people can take medication for it. I take medication for my ADHD. But for ASD, a lot of it is about access. So it's what a diagnosis will give you in terms of reasonable adjustments. And I mean, we can to a certain extent blame capitalism for this, because a lot of this is about productivity. It's about being productive. And actually, if we were not in a society driven that way, then most people would have reasonable adjustments, because it would just be reasonable. Yes, of course you can take a break when you want. Yes, if you need to have downtime in the day, you can. Yes, if the environment's too noisy, then you can do whatever. We don't have that because our society is set up in such a way to make us as productive as possible for the maximum amount of time, until we may or may not be able to retire.
Although interestingly, some IT companies now are actually targeting ASD people, because they realise, like, for example, if they let them sit at their screens with noise-cancelling headphones on, and if they say, I know somebody who can't sit under the air conditioning, and they were working in an environment that was hot desking, but they had their own fixed desk because it wasn't too bright, it wasn't too dark, it didn't have the aircon, and they put the headphones on, and then they get the productivity. That worker bee then becomes productive, and they then make more profit for the company than they would have done otherwise. So capitalism cuts both ways.
No, absolutely. And I think that I didn't for a long time realise how much noise environments affect me. In fact, that is why I got diagnosed, because I was posted to an open office, a huge, massive office with an entire corridor of people, and then I stopped being able to do my work. And that was when I noticed. It's really interesting. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for participating and coming to see us. We will be going down into the Waterstones shop just by there to sign books and have a chat. You're welcome to come and see us. Thank you very much for coming. Take care all. Thank you.
Thank you.